I'm in my knitting era right now. I'm just a granny who sits in bed at 9:30 knitting my little sweaters. Do you guys want to see what I actually made with all of that yarn? This is not the point of the video, but here we are. It's a little pixie hood, and it has its little pixie tail. It's so cute. Anyways, hello and welcome back to my channel, and welcome to episode number 2 of Dear KatieHD, the advice column series on my channel where I try to answer your questions about living life with ADHD. Before we get into the question, the write-in for today, I want to first thank everybody who is watching this video and everybody who has written in. I received quite a fair number of questions in the Google form, which I will also leave in the description below if you'd like to submit your question, your story, your rant, whatever it may be, because I am just like really excited that people actually took me up on the offer to have this little advice column series on my channel. So I really love to talk and I really love to help people, and I thought what better way to do that than in an advice style YouTube video. So go ahead and check out that Google form if you yourself have something you need advice on regarding ADHD. If you're wondering who the heck I am and why you should listen to me, well, that's a great question. If you are new to my channel, welcome. My name is Katie, and I have made a lot of content on my YouTube channel about my educational journey, starting from community college, getting my bachelor's degree, and then getting my master's degree. Along the way, I was late diagnosed with ADHD at 26 years old, and I have spent the last 3 years attempting to understand ADHD and to suss out the ways in which it impacts my life. When I answer these questions, I am not claiming to be a professional because I do not have a degree in anything related to ADHD. I'm not a doctor, I am not a psychiatrist, and I am not a trained ADHD coach. I am simply speaking from my lived experience of being a student with unmedicated and for the most part undiagnosed ADHD. So anytime I answer these questions, I am speaking from my lived experience, and I hope that that's enough for you. I totally understand if it's not, but I think that we should make space for each other to talk about that lived experience because, I mean, I learn a lot from other people when they do so, and I hope that you learn a lot in this video here. So Dear KatieHD number 2 asks, what accommodations or systems did you implement when writing your master's thesis and conducting research? I am dealing with writing anxiety and struggle with writing in general. I hope that little explanation about my background and being an unmedicated, undiagnosed student makes a little bit more sense with this question. I broke it up into 2 main sections. I have a section on doing the research, so like conducting your field work, whatever that looks like for you, and then the writing aspect of things. I think what I'll do is start with the research part because it's a little bit more like straight to the point and are real practical tips that will help you if you're doing field work. In the second part, I'll get to writing. I had a lot to say about the writing part, so we're going to start with the easy and end with the lengthy. So when I was doing my field work, I consider myself to be a cultural or social anthropologist. So this means doing ethnography. And ethnography and participant observation is the process of actually going out into a place, the field, where the people are, and sitting and observing and interacting with the people that you're studying. So in my case, I was going to vintage markets. And vintage markets are a little bit of a sensory hellscape in my personal opinion, because on one hand, I do absolutely love getting to see and touch all of the vintage, but on the other hand, getting to see and touch all of that vintage over an entire day can be really exhausting. There's always music playing, there's people talking, the temperature fluctuates, there's people around you and bumping into you, so it can be a really exhausting experience. So here are the things that I did to try to accommodate that for myself. Number 1, I always take my noise canceling headphones pretty much wherever I go, but especially when I was doing that field work. Now, the thing is, if you're an anthropologist like me, you will have to talk to people eventually, but if you can maybe break it up between a couple of days or a couple of weeks, I spent the first day at each of the shows that I went to just observing and sitting there with my noise canceling headphones on. That way, the next day when I came, I was more familiar with the environment. I knew that there was going to be loud noise, so I didn't plan a lot of other things to do in my day because that noise in particular is something that really tires me out. And I essentially prepared myself to be overstimulated. I should also pause here and say that fieldwork looks a little bit different for everybody. Again, in my case, fieldwork is going out and hanging out with people. but if you are a historian and you're working in the archive, or if you're doing lab work, the accommodations that you're going to have to give yourself are going to look a little bit different, but I'm sure that some of these are adaptable to your situation. For example, wearing noise canceling headphones in an archive or wearing them in a lab, if it is safe to do so in a lab, is one way that you can accommodate yourself. The second thing that I did is I spent a lot of time getting comfortable. So like I said, I spent the whole first day that I was at these vintage events just sitting and observing. I was lucky in that a lot of these events do have seating, and the one that I went to specifically had like big comfy couches and chairs, so I could actually literally get physically comfortable. I know that not all research is going to look like that, but again, I think considering your own comfort, if you're in an archive, choosing a quiet space or a quiet desk, or maybe requesting a different chair, and if you're in the lab, getting comfortable with where everything is in the lab or asking for a tour, etc., is going to help you just be able to navigate and feel a little bit less overwhelmed when you're actually like sitting with the data that you're going to be working with. The third thing that I recommend when it comes to doing fieldwork and doing research is to try not to think too hard about the way that you're taking your notes. Everybody is going to have to take notes, and in this particular case, I don't think that my advice will work for people who work in labs where you have to keep your data a lot more structured. But if you're in the humanities and social sciences, I really recommend just writing free-form notes. Don't think too hard about how they're organized, because what you want to be doing is capturing that information as it comes to you. The fourth piece of advice that I have for the fieldwork section is to write a brain dump at the end of every field day, or like a free writing session. When I did my fieldwork, I was taking my notes when I was in person at these events, and then I would also go back to my hotel afterwards, pull up my computer, and I would just dump every single thought that I had about that field session without thinking, again, too hard about what I was writing, the quality of that writing, whether or not it made sense, etc., because it's something that I was going to come back to later. I did try to supplement with the free-form notes that I took in my actual notebook, which is why I say it's really important to take notes in your notebook. It was that end of the day moment where I could essentially process all of the thoughts and the feelings that I'd had that day while doing fieldwork in this kind of brain dump format. And because it was like so freeform and had no structure whatsoever, it was very easy to approach. What mattered the most was that I was just capturing my observations. This is something that I think actually might work well for a lot of people, a lot of researchers with ADHD, regardless of what field you're in, because we just have so many thoughts all of the time. And the sad thing is we cannot address every single thought, even though I know you want to, because Lord knows I do. So maybe having a moment at the end of every day or at the end of a week where you just kind of like dump all of those thoughts about your research out onto paper so you can make a little bit of space in your brain, and then come back to those thoughts later. Some of them you might realize weren't actually worth looking at, and some of them you might realize, oh hey, I'm actually really glad I wrote that down because it's the key to my thesis and I would have forgotten it otherwise. In essence, just write everything down, but don't be precious about it. Just get it down there. My next piece of advice for doing field work, for doing your research, is to bring your sensory toys with you if you need them. I am a sensory girly. I get overwhelmed by sensory input, but I am also a sensory seeker, and fidget toys or things like a knitting project are really helpful for me for stimming and for self-regulation. So not only am I like a fidgety person because I have ADHD, so like wearing rings or jewelry I could play with was like a way of being hyperactive and stimming in a more like socially acceptable format. But then I was also able to like ground myself when I was sitting down and just observing and taking notes by having like a tangle snake with me or a fidget cube or a fidget spinner, like whatever fidget toy it is that works for you. I would recommend having it on hand because you never know when you're going to need it. The last thing that I have to say about doing field work, and this is actually a really big piece of advice that I give to anybody with ADHD who asks me about doing research or who asks me about going to school, is that I research and I go to school for exactly what it is that I enjoy. So it's almost always a pleasurable experience. I'm not gonna sit here and lie to you and gaslight you guys and say that school is fun, but like when I feel passionate about a thing, I am far more willing to engage in that thing than I am for literally anything else. I mean, it's why I have enjoyed being in school for so long. I don't always love the dependence that I have on academic validation and feeling burnt out at the end of the semester. But when I have a reason and like a deadline to produce something, to like write about something that I really care about, I have a really hard time getting myself to do that on my own. So having the deadline of school really helps. And then I'm writing about something that I actually feel really strongly about. So the words come with less friction than they would about a subject I don't care anything about, right? Like, you're never going to find me doing research or a degree in some like STEM related field because I am not somebody who enjoys those topics. So if that is something you haven't considered, or if you are finding yourself in the boat of like researching what it is you think you should research, that's going to make your life a lot more difficult. And forget about having ADHD, that's just difficult for anybody. So the thing that I recommend the most when it comes to doing something as difficult as research for anybody, and then especially if you have ADHD, because doing something you don't like with ADHD is near impossible, is to research what you love. And actually, as I'm saying this out loud, I'm realizing I'm kind of speaking to myself a little bit here, because I'm kind of like in between a couple of potential PhD research topics when I get to the point of applying for PhDs. And one of them I think would be really enjoyable and I think would make me feel fulfilled and would be like a pleasurable experience for the most part. And the other one actually like actively makes me depressed. So why am I even this is not the topic of this video, but if you guys want to hear more about that, let me know, because boy, do I have words to say about like the pressure that comes from society about doing or not doing a PhD, and then like what you do that PhD in. Anyways, I'm kind of rambling here. Oh my God, I'm gonna cry. This is the nicest YouTube comment I've ever gotten. Oh my God. There's a ladybug on my camera. So much is happening right now. What's going on? Colin Lewin 9684 just commented on my last video, which was about becoming a fashion professor. I'm a PhD candidate in astrophysics, but I followed you for a while and I must come out of the shadows to tell you that you deserve to have this position and you deserve to have this impact. You are capable of touching so many students' brains and hearts, and I know you will. This is part of your purpose in some way, and have a beautiful time. Well, Colin Lewin 9684, thank you very much. And that has a little bit derailed when they were filming this video, but if you're watching this, thank you. And I don't think you understand how much, and I hope that you understand how much that means to me, but I'm gonna try to keep going because wow, gosh. So that's what I have to say about doing the fieldwork research. I'm so sorry. Okay, I'm gonna try to get back on track. I know that that was really rapid fire. I just want to make sure that I touched on those like very practical tips before I move on to the next part, which is writing. I have both like technical practical tips as well as like a spiel about the like emotional part of like doing research and writing. So firstly, when I was writing my master's thesis, I want to empathize and say that I was also a very anxious writer because I was never sure if I was doing it in the right way, if I was starting in the right spot, if I was saying the right things. And unfortunately, I had a very absentee advisor, so I was pretty much left to my own devices to figure it out, and that was terrifying. So the first thing that I did when I realized that I was avoiding my writing, and this is what I do whenever I'm avoiding pretty much any kind of like deep focus work or like deep thinking work, I made a promise to myself that I only had to write for 1 hour a day. It didn't matter, or at least I had to show up to write for 1 hour a day, and I use my visual timer to track that hour so I can see the time passing and realize that it's not actually as torturous as I think it is because I build it up so much in my head. So I set my visual timer for 1 hour, and all I have to do is sit at my desk and look at my document. If I get any writing done, that's a win. The thing is about doing that, though, is that I found it relieved some weird pressure that I was putting on myself to have the whole thing finished right then and there, because I know us ADHD folks, we want the thing to be done right now. Like, the taking things step by step is almost a torturous process. Telling myself that I only had to write for 1 hour kind of like took that big, giant, daunting task and made it so small that I was like, An hour? That's nothing. I can do an hour. I'm going to show an hour who's bitch, actually. And something about the visual timer always really helps me lock in too. So I almost always wrote past the hour. But the thing is, if I hit that hour and it was not going well, I could stop. I also utilized Do Not Disturb on my phone during that hour to make sure that I wasn't getting any notifications and that I wasn't getting distracted, essentially. So I use Do Not Disturb, and I make a specific setting for study and deep focus where I will not get any notifications unless it is my husband or my mother, and they have to call me twice for the notification to go through, because in that instance, I know it's an emergency. So that is how I use Do Not Disturb on my phone to avoid distractions. The next thing that I did was I put a literal, physical Do Not Disturb sign on the back of my chair, because my husband and I have always shared an office space, and the thing is, I love my husband, and he is the most interesting thing on the face of the planet to me, so I will find any excuse to distract myself from my work and hang out with my husband instead. So I had to put a Do Not Disturb sign on the back of my chair to let him know. If he sees that sign, don't even acknowledge my presence, because I will distract myself. So, communicating to the people that you live with, if you do live with people, that you are in a deep work focus mode, or at least you're attempting to spend this time doing that, was always really helpful, because, otherwise, somebody's going to come along and ask me a question or need something from me. But for the 1 hour that the Do Not Disturb sign is on my chair, nobody speaks to me. So make sure that you're communicating with the people that you live with what it is you're trying to do with your time and whether or not now is an acceptable time to distract you. It goes a long way, actually. Another practical thing is that I keep food and snacks and candy nearby when I'm working on a big research project like a master's thesis. I'm not going to say that this is the healthiest thing that I've ever done, but I did in fact keep a little jar on my desk fully stocked of Nerds gummy clusters, and I would eat those as I worked. When I worked was the only time that I ate them. So I tried to associate something that I greatly enjoy, like candy. Also, candy, that type of candy specifically, is a great sensory experience. So getting to associate my work with something that I love to eat was a big motivating factor for me. Again, I'm not saying this is the healthiest thing to do, because I have struggled with nutrition and binge eating, and especially around things like candy and chips. So if it's something that you have a little bit more control around, maybe give it a go, but I'm just going to be honest and say that that's what I did. One of the things that I did. I also think that it's really important to have a study ritual. And this is actually something that is proven in the research in a book called Transforming ADHD. It's one of the books that I recommend the most when it comes to learning about and coping with ADHD. One of the big arguments that they make is that your environment plays just as much of a part in directing your attention as anything else. Hence the Do Not Disturb sign on my chair, right? So if you can make your environment one that helps to direct your attention towards the things you want to direct it to, it's going to be much easier for your attention to slide into that focus. So for me, that always looked like using the same kind of music for every study session. Specifically, it is the Harry Potter classroom ambiance, where it has the Harry Potter music, the images of the Harry Potter classroom, and then the rustling of papers and the scratching of quills. That is the soundtrack of my master's thesis. I would listen to that ambiance video. I would wear my noise-canceling headphones. I lit the same candle, and I have a desk that has everything that I need for a deep work session. So all of my books were in that spot. It was decorated in a way that I liked. It had all my pens and it had all my sticky notes. So it was a place that I actually enjoyed being in. And you're going to hear that come up quite a lot in any of my videos about ADHD, is that you have to make it something that you enjoy doing, because otherwise you're not going to want to do it. So something about the sound, the same sound, the same spot, and the same scent all together told my brain that this was work time. So I really associated those things with writing. And that is one way that I tried to get my brain into that focus or that flow state. Another practical thing that you can do is to visit the writing center if you're having difficulty with structure, or if you're stuck on something, but also to have friends or study buddies or an online service like Accepted Society to body double with, and to help you process the process is what I was going to say, to help you process the act of writing a research project, because it's a lot, not just in terms of like the things that you have to like hold in your brain and thinking through all this data and trying to hold all this theory in your head, but it's also an emotional process. So having somebody's help is really, really important, even if it's just body doubling for accountability, or if it's like going to the writing center to get help with grammar and structure and flow and all that kind of stuff, or if it's venting to some friends because you need to just get it out. Having other people there to help you is something that's going to be really important for getting through this process. I also kept a visual chapter breakdown. I did this a couple of different ways. I had on Notion a literature database that had all of the books that I was reading for my master's thesis, all of the articles. It was like this Notion Zotero integration that I learned by watching Holly Jane's YouTube video about it, so I will leave a link to that in the description. And you should also follow her YouTube channel. She is hilarious and just like a bright light in this world. And then on Notion, you can also have a calendar that has a timeline view of the calendar. So I also had all of the deadlines per the thesis guide that my program provided me. So I had all of the dates, the deadlines, like what we were supposed to be doing when in that visual timeline, so I could see as time was passing, like what my focus for that week should be. That was like mostly helpful, but the thing that I found even more helpful was that I kept a thesis journal, and I would also like write my chapters out on flashcards and stick them on the wall or stick them on like an easel or something, so I could like visually see how my chapters were coming together and then physically move them around if I thought that the flow wasn't working very well. Making things visual is super, super helpful, and I know that like Kaylin and Kate, if you don't follow Kate, I'll also leave her channel in the description below, use a digital version of this kind of like mood board style of writing called Scrintl. I use Milanote because it's free, but either one I think would really work for, doing this kind of digitally, but having some kind of like visual version of your thesis I found to be really helpful. I also did not start with my introduction. I don't know how other people's programs do this, but in my program we had to write the first third of our thesis, then the second third, then the third third of our thesis, or the last third. And we were expected to write like the introduction first. I'm like, how am I supposed to write about something for which I have not collected and analyzed the data yet? Because I'm just going to be making stuff up until I actually get to writing the chapters and doing my analysis. So when I went to my program director about this, she said, well, don't think about it as the first third, just think about it as a third. And that really helped me because I did essentially write an outline for my introduction, but I focused mainly on the literature review in my introduction because I knew that reviewing the literature at the end was going to be a bad idea. I did in fact have to go back and revise my literature review at some point, but I think that that's pretty par for the course. We are constantly going back and revising introductions and, trying to make sense of what it is that we were doing with the data as we go. The thing about writing a master's thesis that I've learned, and this is important to know if you have ADHD, because I know my brain doesn't think linearly, but I thought I was supposed to be thinking in a linear fashion in order to write this thesis, because a thesis is like a fairly linear progression of things, right? You have your introduction, a couple of chapters where you like analyze some examples to build your argument, and then your conclusion. But I did not write it that way. And I found out, I guess, the difficult way by having to go through it, that anything that you write in one section of your thesis is going to affect other parts of your thesis as well. So I thought of writing my thesis more like a circular exercise where I was constantly going through and revising the things that were in relationship with one another. That sounds really abstract, but I mean that like when I got to writing my chapters about my actual like data, whatever that may be, my observations and the interviews that I did with people, I would often find something in those interviews that spoke to a certain theory, and so I had to go back to my literature review and kind of adjust that. And as I continued to go back and forth between the different pieces of my thesis, a structure just kind of like emerged out of it. And this is how I have often written even like smaller things like essays, where I'm kind of writing the whole thing at the same time. So working a little bit here, a little bit there, a little bit here, which then I have to go and revise something over here Does that make sense? It was not a very linear process for me. So if you are having a hard time starting at the introduction, like that makes sense, first of all, because it's really difficult to write an introduction. And especially if your program is asking you to write an introduction before you have your data, it doesn't make any sense. So don't feel too bad if you're writing it in kind of like a non-linear fashion, because I certainly didn't. And I don't think most people do. Once again, folks, we have run into the battery problem in which I refused to buy a new battery for my camera because it is $50. So I had to stop and charge my battery, and I ate dinner and watched an episode of Voyager, Star Trek Voyager, and worked on my knitting project while I waited for it to charge. But we're back now. If you would like to help me buy a new battery, my Ko-fi link is in the description. Please, for the love of God, I'd love to film one video without having to recharge my battery halfway through. But anyways, the last practical piece of advice that I have is that you are going to need multiple documents. I know some people might thrive off of using just one giant master document, but personally, I had to think about 4 digital documents and 1 physical document. And let me break that down for you so you see what I mean. The first document that I had was a document called Thesis Thoughts. This is literally where I put anything and everything that had an inkling related to my thesis. Any thought that I had, a quote that I read, something a friend said, or a scholar to look into, anything that was slightly related to my thesis that I thought I might use, it went into Thesis Thoughts. Eventually, I started breaking this down into having headers so I could have a navigable, is that the word? A navigable outline on Google Docs. I would also use it for things that I wrote that I liked but wasn't sure was going to go into my thesis. And I also used it to store pieces of my thesis that I actually cut out of the thesis during the editing process. So it's just kind of helpful to have a catch-all document like that. The second document I had was, of course, my field notes, and that lived in a separate Google document so I could see those things side by side. The third document I had was a running rough draft on Google Docs as well, and that also had a table of contents. That's what it's called, right? That was also clickable, so I could navigate more quickly through the actual document itself because it ended up being 84 pages. And then I had a fourth Google document that was a copy of my thesis. And this was not my working thesis. This was the thesis that I would send my advisor. So the rough draft version is the one that I actually worked on, and then the official version I would copy and paste my thesis into anytime I made updates, and that is the one that was actually shared with my advisor because I didn't want my advisor to see what I was thinking out loud to myself in my comments and in my footnotes and things like that, so I only sent her the stuff that was polished, and if I had questions that I'd left myself in the rough draft version, I would bring those to her in meetings, but again, I had a very absentee advisor, so I did most of this by myself. If you have a better relationship with your advisor, it might be a better idea to have them clued into your rough draft as well, because maybe they'll be able to answer those questions or offer insight, but I did not have that kind of advisor. And lastly, the physical document that I had was at the very end when I was going through and revising and editing, doing line edits essentially, I printed out a hard copy of my thesis, and this was where I would actually sit down and read my thesis to myself and mark things I didn't like, spelling mistakes, grammar errors, things like that. And then I had that physical document to put in my lap while I was looking at my computer to make those edits. That was a little bit tedious, but I found that having a physical copy of my thesis made it a lot easier to read because most of the time I'm staring at a screen anyways, and I don't want to be reading on a screen. And then I could also put pages next to each other to kind of visualize the actual flow of the thesis. Essentially, just make what you can about your thesis more visual, even if that means having a physical printout of your thesis that you have every week or whatever it is that works for you. Okay, now that I have talked for 40 minutes about all of the practical things that I did when writing my thesis, I want to talk about the second half of this question, or it's kind of more of a statement, that this person who wrote in says that they're dealing with writing anxiety and struggle with writing in general, and girl, let me tell you, same. S-A-M-E. Same, I get it. I have not written, I'm not going to say a single thing since I graduated 7 months ago, but I definitely have once bitten, twice shy feelings about writing at the moment because writing is really hard. Writing, and especially writing research, requires not only the ability to concentrate and focus and kind of collect your thoughts in a communicable way, which is already difficult for people with ADHD, but it also requires deep thinking and consideration and pondering and being able to capture all of that. I mean, how does anybody do it? It is a really difficult process, and there's a reason why not everybody goes on to get master's or PhD degrees, because it's difficult. What I find with people who ask me questions about dealing with the anxieties and the struggles of writing are the people who think that they shouldn't feel that way. And I am here to tell you that you feel how you feel about something. And if it's a feeling anxiety or struggling with writing in general, yeah, it makes sense. It's totally okay to feel that way. I think that writing is a really emotional experience and nobody ever describes it that way. So if you haven't heard somebody say it before, I'm here to say it for you. I mean, I feel so many feelings. I'm trying to think about all the feelings that I feel about it. It's I'm having a hard time recalling it because I've blocked it in my brain or something. But I recall also feeling anxious. I recall feeling frustrated when I couldn't get my brain to cooperate. I recall feeling like maybe I wasn't good enough or that my writing wasn't good enough. I felt unsure. I doubted what I was saying. I doubted my knowledge of the subject. Writing is just hard. Emotionally, skill-wise, having the command of a language, communicating it, I get it. And when I finally just acknowledged that sometimes it is an emotional experience, that made it so much better. But it wasn't without the help of friends and family and therapists that I was able to come to that place. They gave me the space to acknowledge that I was having these difficult feelings about it, and that made it better for me to just have the feelings and then do it anyways. Does that make sense? I'm saying that just because you have those feelings doesn't mean you can't do it. And that sometimes you just gotta do it while you're having those feelings. I don't know if I'm communicating this well. Let me give you an example. I cannot count the times that I have sat at my desk trying to write, getting really angry that I'm not writing, getting really down on myself for not writing, feeling frustrated that I have the words in my head but they won't come out onto the keyboard and into my computer. And I would sit there and I would cry. I would sit at my desk, I would be looking at my thesis, and I would just cry. And as I was crying, I would pick up my keyboard and I would start writing again. Literally tears falling down my face and hitting my keyboard, I would be writing. And I don't mean this in the I'm pushing myself past my limit kind of way. I mean this in the I have to feel these feelings, but I don't want that to stop me from accomplishing this thing. Trying to not feel your feelings about these things will actively get in the way of you accomplishing what it is that you want to do. It sounds counterintuitive, right? If I have these feelings, if I let myself have them, it's going to prevent me from doing the thing. When I have found that trying to push those feelings away is what makes the anxiety worse. And I've been the most successful when I've just let myself have those big feelings while I'm doing the thing. But of course, my home was a safe place to do that, and my now husband would literally sit and rub my back or hold my hand. He would sit right next to me at my desk while I was having those big feelings about it. And I'm also lucky enough to have had a therapist at that time who I really clicked with and who really celebrated even the tiniest of wins that I was having. So if that is something that you have access to, I would so highly recommend it. It is going to be an emotional process no matter what. I'm gonna call Kaylin out here for a second and point you towards her vlogs and take a look at how often she cries. Kaylin documents in a much better way than I ever can that emotional experience, and she's not afraid to show it. She's very vulnerable about it, and I find that that's really freeing to see another person acknowledge that this is something that sometimes you just have big feelings about. I really don't know if any of that helps. I too was in a place where I kind of am in a place right now where writing, just the idea of it kind of gets my heart racing and I feel bad at the thought of doing it. And I have been trying to practice what I'm saying here, where I feel bad through it, not feel bad around it, or to avoid it because it makes me feel bad. I think that it says so much more about you as a person and as a researcher if you have the ability to feel through things rather than to avoid them because of it. Like that requires strength. That requires vulnerability. That requires like faith in yourself. And those things are really hard won. So like if you're struggling, I feel you, but I believe in you too. Like I know I'm waxing a little bit poetic about this, but I know how it feels and I see you. I think I wouldn't have been able to finish my master's thesis if I hadn't had that realization about the emotional experience of writing. I'll also say ADHD is a really emotional experience. I think that emotional regulation or dysregulation should be a diagnostic criteria in the DSM-5. It is such a common experience, especially for AFAB folks who are diagnosed with ADHD. So even outside of writing, even outside of research, having ADHD just makes life an overly emotional experience. So learning how to not be afraid of those feelings is going to do a lot of good in your life. At least it has for me. I realized I didn't really talk about medication in this video. I don't know if I've ever told anybody this, but I finished my master's thesis entirely unmedicated. What? How? I don't know. I mean, I burnt out a little bit at the end of my master's degree, so if you take this advice, take it with a grain of salt, because by the end I was definitely like, whew, I don't know if I can do that again. That's where I am right now whenever people ask me about doing a PhD. But again, I will talk about that in a later video because I don't want to think about it right now. But if you do take medication, one of the things that I recommend is to pay attention, build awareness around how that medication takes its course in your body throughout the day. So like, when do you feel it kick in? Is it affected by what you eat? When do you feel it start to fade? And try to kind of schedule the heavy lifting stuff like writing a master's thesis around those ebbs and flows. I was far more effective at writing around like 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. and then again later on in the evening when I tend to get like a burst of energy. So that's kind of how I like try to be aware of my energy levels and like how I could use that to my best advantage. And the same goes for like when you're taking medication, because I know I just said I was unmedicated while I was writing. Gosh, I don't even know who that girl was. How did she do that? And she also graduated with honors, and that's totally wild to me, because if you told me that I had to do that again, or like if it was a matter of life and death, I'm sorry, but I would be in a grave right now. That sounds so pessimistic. It sounds so pessimistic, but boy, howdy, let me tell you, I was tired after finishing my master's thesis. I got sick, actually, the week after graduation. I read 7 like fantasy romance books in one sitting, and then I went home to California to get married, and then I did nothing, and I've been doing nothing. That's not true. I haven't been doing nothing, but I certainly have not been in school. Okay, now I'm just rambling and talking to myself. I do apologize for the fact that this video is going to be really long, but I appreciate you listening. I have to admit, ever since I moved to the Midwest, I've been just a tiny bit lonely because I don't know anybody out here besides my husband's family, and they live 3 hours away, so getting the chance to talk to the camera feels a little bit like talking to a friend. I think I'm going to leave it there because otherwise I will just continue to talk. If you are wanting some solidarity through this process, I would highly recommend watching my vlogs from my master's thesis, watching Kate's vlogs as she's doing hers, and Kaylin's vlogs as she's in the final like dissertation writing process. Yeah, go watch all of those vlogs. Thank you so much for writing in and trusting me with your question. I hope that you found something useful from this. If anybody else watching has a question, please feel free to leave it in the Google form below. Do check out my coffee if you want to help me buy a new battery. Don't forget to subscribe and take this moment to show up for our community, guys. What advice do you have for this person? Share your thoughts about writing and approaching writing as somebody with ADHD in the comments below, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye, everybody.